Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I grew up hearing the same nickname over and over again, drama queen. It didn't matter if I was 8 years old crying because my teacher yelled at me, or 16 years old having a panic attack before an exam. My parents would exchange that same look with each other, a quiet little smile, the kind that said, "Here she goes again." Then my mother would sigh dramatically and say, "Emily, must everything be a performance with you?" At first, I believed them. When you're a kid, you assume your parents know you better than anyone else. If they say you're exaggerating your feelings, then maybe you are. Maybe every fear feels bigger than it really is. Maybe every ache, every dizzy spell, every moment where your chest feels too tight to breathe is just you being overly sensitive. That's what I told myself for years. But there were things I couldn't explain. The fainting spell started when I was 14. I'd be standing in the kitchen or walking down the hallway at school, and suddenly my vision would shrink like someone was slowly dimming the lights. My ears would ring, my legs would feel like they weren't attached to me anymore. Then everything would go black. The first time it happened, my teacher called my parents immediately. I remember sitting in the nurse's office with a blanket around my shoulders, waiting for my mom to arrive. I thought she would be worried. I thought she would rush in and hug me. Instead, when she walked through the door, she rolled her eyes. "Emily," she said, her voice low and irritated, "you fainted during a math test?" I nodded, confused. "Well, that's convenient," she replied. Even now, 15 years later, I can still hear the sarcasm in her voice. The doctor said it could be stress, maybe dehydration, maybe low blood pressure. Nothing serious, they said, but the episodes kept happening. Not enough for people to think something was seriously wrong, just enough for my parents to think I was doing it on purpose. By the time I reached college, the nickname had followed me like a shadow, drama queen. My younger brother, Daniel, loved repeating it. At family dinners, he'd grin and say, "Careful, everyone, Emily might collapse if the mashed potatoes are too salty." Everyone would laugh, except me. I learned to hide things. When my chest hurt, I didn't mention it. When my heart started racing out of nowhere, I would quietly excuse myself and sit in the bathroom until it passed, because asking for help had never worked. Still, despite everything, I kept hoping that one day my parents would take me seriously, that one day they would look at me and see a daughter who needed support instead of attention. That moment never came. The worst night of my life started as something that was supposed to be happy. My Aunt Carol was celebrating her 50th birthday. She had rented out a large dining hall at a local restaurant, and the entire extended family was invited. 25 people, maybe, more. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, uncles telling loud stories, children running between the tables. The room smelled like roasted chicken, warm bread, and vanilla cake. I almost didn't go. Something about that day felt wrong. My chest had been tight since the morning. My hands kept trembling for no reason. I remember standing in my apartment kitchen, staring at my phone, thinking about texting my mom that I wasn't feeling well. But I already knew what she would say. "Don't be dramatic, Emily." So I went. When I walked into the restaurant, my mother spotted me immediately. "There she is," she announced loudly to the table. "Our resident drama queen has arrived." People laughed. I forced a smile and sat down. For the first hour, everything was normal. Conversations bounced around the table. My cousin talked about her new job. My uncle told the same fishing story he'd been telling for 10 years. I sipped water and tried to ignore the strange fluttering in my chest. But then it started, that familiar feeling, like the air around me was suddenly thinner. My fingers tingled. My heartbeat became loud in my ears. I shifted in my chair, hoping it would pass. Sometimes it did. Not this time. The room began to tilt slightly. The lights above the table blurred into soft halos. I remember gripping the edge of the table, trying to stay steady. Across from me, my brother noticed. "Oh no," Daniel said loudly. "Look at her face. Is this another performance?" My mother sighed. "Emily," she said, not even lowering her voice, "please don't start." I tried to speak, but the words came out weak. "Mom, I don't feel—" She cut me off. "You're fine." The ringing in my ears grew louder. Conversations around the table started to sound distant, like they were happening underwater. My hands were shaking now. "I think I need to sit down," I whispered. "You are sitting down," Daniel said, laughing. A few people chuckled. And then everything went black. The last thing I remember before hitting the floor was hearing a glass shatter somewhere nearby. The chair tipped over with me, and the sound echoed across the room. For a moment, there was silence. Then voices. "Oh my God, did she just faint?" Someone moved toward me. I felt hands on my shoulder, but before anyone could say anything else, my mother's voice cut through the room like a knife. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she said loudly, "not again." I couldn't open my eyes yet, but I could hear everything. "She always does this," my mother continued. "Every family event becomes about Emily somehow." My chest felt heavy. I struggled to breathe. An unfamiliar voice spoke gently. "Ma'am, maybe we should call an ambulance." "No," my father said immediately. "Absolutely not. She'll be fine in a minute." Someone else whispered, "She's still on the floor." And then my mother said the words I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Just leave her. If we ignore it, the show will end faster." The room fell quiet again, and slowly, painfully, I realized something. Not one person at that table knew the truth about what had been happening to me for years. Not one person knew about the doctor appointment my parents had forced me to cancel when I was 17. Not one person knew about the medical file my mother had hidden. Not one person that 2 months earlier, a cardiologist had finally discovered something that explained everything. Something my parents had already known about. Something they had spent 15 years pretending didn't exist. And that night, lying on the cold restaurant floor while 25 relatives watched, the truth was about to come out. I wish I could say that when I collapsed, someone rushed to help me immediately, that someone knelt beside me, checked my pulse, called for an ambulance, or even just spoke to me with concern. But the truth is more complicated than that. When I first fell, there was confusion in the room, the kind that happens when people don't quite know what they're witnessing. Chairs scraped against the floor. A few of my cousins stood up halfway, unsure if they should move closer. I could hear whispers weaving through the air like threads. But then my mother spoke. Her voice carried across the entire room, firm and dismissive. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she said again, louder this time. "Not again." And that was the moment everything shifted. You see, when a parent sounds confident about something, people tend to believe them. If the mother of the girl lying on the floor says this is normal, that it's just another dramatic stunt, most people assume she must be right. My father added to it. "Emily has always been like this," he said calmly. "She faints when she doesn't get enough attention." A couple of relatives chuckled awkwardly. Someone nearby said, "Oh, okay." And just like that, the concern in the room dissolved into uncomfortable acceptance. But I was still conscious. That's the strange thing about fainting. People imagine it like flipping a switch, lights out, nothingness. But for me, it was more like being trapped in fog. My body wouldn't respond, my eyes wouldn't open, but my ears worked perfectly. So I heard everything. My chair was still lying on its side beside me. I could feel the cool restaurant floor pressing against my cheek. My arms felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. But the voices around me were clear. "I mean, she does this a lot?" one of my cousins asked quietly. "All the time," my brother Daniel replied, laughing softly. "You'd think she'd at least come up with a new trick." A few people laughed again. That laugh felt worse than the fall.
Someone else spoke then. I think it was my Aunt Carol, the birthday woman herself. Her voice sounded uncertain. Well, she did hit the floor pretty hard. My mother sighed dramatically. She's done worse. Last Christmas, she nearly knocked over the dessert table. That wasn't even true. But the story landed anyway. You could almost feel the room relaxing, people shifting back into their seats, conversation slowly restarting. Because the easiest thing in the world is believing that someone else is exaggerating. My breathing was shallow. My chest hurt in a way that was becoming frighteningly familiar. I tried to move my fingers, but they barely twitched. Inside my head, panic was rising. Not again. 2 months earlier, a cardiologist had looked at me across a desk with a seriousness I had never seen in any doctor before. He had tapped a file with his finger and said quietly, "Emily, this condition should have been monitored years ago." Years ago. The words echoed through my mind as I lay there on the restaurant floor. But in that moment, none of the 25 people around me knew what the doctor had said. None of them knew that my heart had an electrical irregularity that could cause sudden blackouts. None of them knew that untreated episodes could become dangerous. Because my parents had made sure no one knew. I heard footsteps approach. Someone crouched down near me. "Emily?" a soft voice said. It was my cousin Lily. She was one of the few people in our family who had always been kind to me. I could hear her worry in her voice. "She's really pale," Lily said. My mother responded immediately. "She always is after these little episodes." "But she hasn't moved," Lily insisted. My father spoke then, his tone still annoyingly calm. "Just give her a minute." I wanted to scream. I wanted to sit up and shout that something was wrong, that this wasn't a performance, that my heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. But my body refused to cooperate. Instead, my breathing became more uneven. Lily must have noticed. "Her breathing sounds weird," she said. A pause followed. Then Daniel spoke again, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Wow, she's really committing to the role tonight." More laughter. It was quieter this time, but it still happened. That was when something unexpected broke through the fog in my mind. Anger. A slow, heavy anger that had been building for years without me realizing it. Because as I lay there listening to them dismiss me again and again, a memory forced its way to the surface. I was 17 years old, sitting in the back seat of my parents' car. My hands were shaking as I held a folded piece of paper. It was a referral from a doctor who had finally decided my fainting spells needed a specialist's attention. A cardiologist. I remember looking at my mother in the driver's seat. "Can we make the appointment?" I asked. She didn't even glance back. "Emily, you are not going to start this again." "But the doctor said..." "The doctor said you're stressed. Teenagers get stressed." My father laughed from the passenger seat. "Besides, we know exactly what the specialist will say." I remember feeling hopeful then. "What?" "That there's nothing wrong with you," he replied. But that's not the part that haunted me. What haunted me was what my mother said next. "Even if there were something wrong," she said flatly, "we are not opening that door again." I hadn't understood what she meant back then. Not fully. But 2 months ago, when I sat in the cardiologist's office holding a newly discovered medical report from my childhood, everything finally made sense. My parents had known. They had known since I was 9 years old. The truth had been sitting in a sealed medical file all those years, and they had buried it. Back in the restaurant, Lily's voice pulled me out of the memory. "Okay, I'm calling an ambulance," she said firmly. "No, you're not," my mother snapped. Lily hesitated. "Why not?" "Because there is nothing wrong with her," my mother said, irritation creeping into every syllable. "She does this to get attention." Another pause followed. Then someone new spoke. It was a man's voice I didn't recognize immediately. "But what if she's not faking it?" That question hung in the air like a storm cloud, and for the first time that night, my parents didn't answer right away. Because at that exact moment, something in my purse, lying on the chair beside the table, began to vibrate loudly against the wood. It kept vibrating, over and over. A phone call. Lily noticed it first. Emily's phone is ringing. No one responded. Then she picked it up. Should I answer? My mother scoffed. It's probably one of her friends. But Lily looked at the screen, and when she read the name out loud, the entire room went silent. It says, slowly she said, Dr. Harris, the cardiologist, and suddenly 25 people were about to hear something my parents had spent 15 years trying to hide.
For a moment, no one spoke after Lily read the name on the screen. Dr. Harris. Those two words floated over the table like something fragile that no one quite wanted to touch. My phone continued to vibrate in Lily's hand, buzzing against the wood of the table in short, insistent bursts. I couldn't see the screen, but I knew exactly why he might be calling. The last time we spoke, he had sounded worried. Emily, he had said during our previous appointment, leaning forward in his chair. If you experience another blackout episode, you must get medical attention immediately. Do you understand me? I had nodded, but I hadn't told him the truth. I hadn't told him that my family believed I was faking it. Back in the restaurant, Lily looked uncertain. Should I answer it? She asked quietly. My mother reacted instantly. No. The words snapped out of her mouth so quickly that several people turned their heads. Lily frowned slightly. But what if it's important? It's not, my mother said sharply. It's probably just some billing office or appointment reminder. The phone buzzed again. My cousin Jake leaned closer. Why would a cardiologist be calling her during dinner? No one answered him. And that silence, that tiny crack in my parents' usual confidence, was the first thing people noticed. You see, my parents had spent years controlling the story about me. To them, I wasn't a daughter with a medical issue. I was the dramatic one, the sensitive one, the girl who exaggerated everything. But the moment Lily read the name of a cardiologist out loud, that story started to wobble. Maybe we should answer, Lily said again. My father cleared his throat. There is no need to involve strangers in family matters. He said that sentence sounded reasonable on the surface, calm, controlled. But I knew my father, and beneath that calm tone was something else. Fear. The phone vibrated one more time. Then it stopped. Lily looked down at the screen. I think it went to voicemail. Good, my mother said immediately. Now can we please get Emily off the floor before she ruins Carol's birthday completely? Those words sent a small ripple through the room, because even though some relatives still looked skeptical of me, others were beginning to look uncomfortable. A woman's voice spoke up from the far end of the table. It was Aunt Carol. Well, maybe we should at least make sure she's okay first. My brother laughed. She'll wake up in a minute. She always does. At that exact moment, my fingers finally twitched. It was small, barely noticeable, but Lily saw it. She moved, Lily said quickly. The room went quiet again. Slowly, painfully, I managed to pull in a deeper breath. My chest still hurt, but the fog in my head was beginning to lift. My eyelids felt heavy, but they opened just enough for me to see shapes above me. Blurry faces, concern on some, annoyance on others. And right in the center, my mother's expression. She looked irritated, not worried. I pushed myself up slightly on one elbow. The room tilted for a moment before settling again. Oh, look, Daniel said loudly, the show's over. A few awkward laughs followed, but they were weaker now, because people had seen how pale I was.
They had seen how long I stayed on the floor, and they had heard the name of the doctor who had just called. Lily knelt beside me. "Emily, can you hear me?" I nodded weakly. "Do you need an ambulance?" Before I could answer, my mother cut in again. "She does not." Then she turned to me with that tight smile she always used when she wanted me to behave. "Emily," she said through clenched teeth, "stand up." I stared at her. Something inside me felt different. For years, I had obeyed that tone automatically. It was the tone that meant, "Stop embarrassing us." But tonight, after hearing everything they said while I was on the floor, something had shifted. "I can't," I whispered. My voice was hoarse. The reaction was immediate. "Oh, here we go," Daniel said. My father sighed. "You're fine, Emily." Lily helped me sit upright against the wall. "She doesn't look fine," Lily said quietly. Across the table, Jake was still holding my phone. Guys," he said, "there's a voicemail." My stomach tightened. My mother's head snapped toward him. "You don't need to play that." But Jake looked confused. "Why not?" "Because it's private," my father replied quickly. Another ripple moved through the group. Private? That word sounded strange in a room full of family members who had just watched me collapse. Jake hesitated. "I mean, if it's about her health—" "Jake," my mother said firmly, "put the phone down." But Jake didn't move. Instead, he looked at me. "Emily, do you want me to play it?" For a second, the entire room waited. 25 people watching. 25 people who had spent years hearing one version of who I was. My heart pounded in my chest. If he played that message, everything would change. Because Dr. Harris had no idea my family believed I was faking my condition. He thought they already knew the truth. My mother spoke again, her voice rising. "Jake, you don't dare." "Yes," I said. The word came out soft, but it cut straight through her sentence. Everyone turned to look at me. My mother stared like she couldn't believe what she had just heard. "What?" "Yes," I repeated, a little stronger. "Play it." The room went completely silent. Jake tapped the screen. The speaker crackled slightly. Then a calm, professional voice filled the room. "Hello, Emily. This is Dr. Harris from Riverside Cardiology." I saw my father's jaw tighten instantly. "I'm calling because I finished reviewing your childhood medical records, and I need to discuss something important with you as soon as possible." A murmur moved through the relatives. "Childhood records?" The doctor continued. "The test results from when you were 9 clearly show signs of a cardiac electrical disorder. It appears this diagnosis was never properly followed up." The room froze. I saw Lily's eyes widen. Jake slowly lowered the phone a little, but the message kept playing. "With your recent episodes of fainting, this condition could be extremely dangerous without treatment." Now people were staring openly, not at me, at my parents. The doctor's voice went on, calm but serious. "I'm concerned that this was known years ago but not addressed. Please contact me immediately so we can start the proper treatment plan." The voicemail ended. For a second, no one spoke. You could practically hear 25 minds trying to piece together what they had just heard. Then Lily whispered the question everyone was thinking. "Wait, they knew about this when she was 9? Every eye in the room turned slowly toward my parents, and for the first time in my life, they had no control over the story anymore.
For several seconds after the voicemail ended, the room was so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the restaurant's air conditioner. 25 people sat frozen around the table. No one laughed. No one made another sarcastic comment. Every single pair of eyes had turned toward my parents. Lily was still kneeling beside me, her hand lightly resting on my shoulder.
I could feel the tension in her body as she looked back and forth between me and my mother. "What did he mean when you were 9?" she asked slowly. My mother's face had gone stiff. The calm confidence she usually carried in social situations was gone, replaced by something tight and uneasy. "You're all misunderstanding," she said quickly, but the words came out a little too fast. Jake still held my phone, staring at the screen like he wasn't sure what to do with it now. "But the doctor literally said it was in her childhood records," he said. My father leaned forward in his chair. "That message was taken out of context," he replied firmly. It was a classic move of his. My father had always believed that if he spoke with enough certainty, people would stop asking questions. But tonight, the certainty didn't work because 25 people had heard the same message and they were all thinking the same thing. My Aunt Carol finally broke the silence. "Wait a minute," she said, looking confused. "Are you saying Emily had a heart condition as a child?" My mother shook her head quickly. "No, of course not." "But that's what the doctor just said," Lily pointed out. My mother opened her mouth, closed it again, then tried a different angle. "It was never confirmed," she said. That statement hung in the air. Not confirmed. That wasn't the same as saying it wasn't real. I pushed myself a little more upright against the wall. My body still felt weak, but the dizziness was slowly fading. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to make the tension go away. I was letting it grow. Daniel spoke next, clearly irritated. "Can we stop acting like this is some huge scandal?" he said. "Emily fainted. Big surprise." But even he sounded less confident than before. Jake frowned. "Dude, the doctor literally said it was dangerous if untreated." Daniel shrugged. "She's been fainting for years and she's still here." My chest tightened again, though this time it wasn't from the condition. It was from hearing how casually my own brother talked about it. Lily looked back at my parents. "So, did doctors ever tell you something was wrong with her heart?" My father's jaw clenched. "No," he said flatly. But Lily didn't look convinced. "Then why did the cardiologist say it was in her childhood records?" My mother laughed nervously. "You know how doctors are. They exaggerate to get patients back in their offices." A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks because that explanation didn't sound right, not even close. My cousin Sarah spoke quietly from across the table. "I work at a hospital," she said. "Doctors don't leave voicemails like that unless something is serious." My mother's smile tightened even further. "Well, Emily has always been good at convincing people she's sick." That sentence might have worked before, but tonight something was different. Tonight, everyone had watched me collapse, and they had heard a cardiologist say the condition had been detected when I was 9. Jake looked between my parents. "So, what happened when she was 9? My father's chair scraped slightly as he shifted. "That was a long time ago, and it's none of your business." The response was so abrupt that several people flinched. Lily looked down at me again. "Emily, did you know about this?" All the attention turned toward me now. For years, I had been the quiet one at family gatherings, the one who smiled politely and tried not to cause problems. But something inside me had cracked open tonight. I looked up at the circle of faces. "I only found out 2 months ago." Gasps spread around the table. "You're kidding," Sarah whispered. I shook my head slowly. "My cardiologist requested my old medical records. That's when he found the tests from when I was 9. I turned my head slightly toward my parents. The tests that said I had a cardiac electrical disorder. My mother's voice rose immediately. "That diagnosis was never confirmed." But it was never investigated either, I replied quietly. My father slammed his hand lightly on the table because it wasn't necessary. The sudden noise startled several people. Lily stared at him. How would you know that? He hesitated, and in that hesitation, the truth started leaking out. My Aunt Carol leaned forward. Wait, she said slowly. You're telling me doctors suspected a heart condition when Emily was a child, and you just ignored it? No, that's not what happened, my mother snapped. Then what did happen? Jake asked. My mother looked at my father. My father looked back at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. That silence told the room more than any explanation could have, because guilty people often pause before they answer. I could see the realization spreading through my relatives like a wave. Something wasn't right. Finally, my father exhaled sharply. The doctors were wrong. Did you get a second opinion? No. Did you take her to a cardiologist? No. Did you do any follow-up tests? My father's voice hardened. No. The word echoed across the table. Sarah leaned back slowly in her chair. So you didn't confirm the diagnosis, but you also didn't check if it was real. My mother crossed her arms defensively. She was a child. Kids faint sometimes. But she kept fainting, Lily said softly. My mother's eyes flashed, and every time she did, it happened when she wanted attention. That was the moment the tension in the room finally snapped, because Lily shook her head. No, she said quietly. Tonight didn't look like someone asking for attention. Several relatives murmured in agreement. My mother opened her mouth to argue again, but I spoke first. You didn't want it to be real. The words were calm, but they landed heavily. My parents turned toward me slowly. What? My father said. You didn't want the diagnosis to be real, I repeated, because if it was, it would change things. The room went silent again. I looked at them both. And you were scared of what those changes might be. My mother laughed bitterly. That's ridiculous. But my father didn't laugh because he knew exactly what I was about to say next. When I was 9, the doctor said I might need ongoing monitoring, medication, maybe even procedures later in life. My gaze stayed on my parents, and those treatments were expensive. The words hit the table like a dropped plate. A slow wave of understanding moved through my relatives. Sarah's eyes widened. Wait, she said. Are you saying they ignored the diagnosis because of money? My mother immediately exploded. That is absolutely not what happened. But no one looked convinced anymore, because suddenly 15 years of fainting spells, 15 years of being called a drama queen were starting to look very different. And the most shocking part of the night hadn't even been revealed yet.
For a few seconds after my words about money settled into the room, no one spoke. The silence felt heavier than anything that had happened earlier that night. It wasn't the confused silence from before when people didn't know what was happening. This silence was different. It was the kind that appears when people suddenly realize the story they believed for years might have been completely wrong. My mother broke it first. That's absurd, she snapped. We would never ignore our child's health because of money. Her voice was louder now, sharper, the calm mask she normally wore around other people starting to crack. But the problem for her was simple. No one was laughing anymore. My cousin Sarah leaned forward, her arms resting on the table. Her expression had shifted from curiosity to something much more serious. Then explain it, she said quietly. My father exhaled through his nose, clearly annoyed that the conversation had reached this point. We didn't ignore anything, he said.
The doctor who mentioned that supposed condition admitted it wasn't confirmed. It could have been a false reading. Then why not test again? Jake asked. My father hesitated. That pause, just 1 second, was enough. Lily noticed it immediately. Because the test would have cost money? She asked carefully. My mother's chair scraped loudly as she shifted. You people are acting like we were monsters, she said. We made the best decision for our family at the time. At the time. Those words echoed in my mind, because hearing them again pulled another memory from the past. I was 9 years old, sitting in the hallway outside a doctor's office. My legs swung nervously above the floor because they were too short to touch it. I remember staring at the strange medical posters on the walls while my parents spoke to the doctor behind a half-closed door. They thought I couldn't hear them, but children hear more than adults realize. The doctor's voice had sounded calm but serious. The EKG results suggest a cardiac conduction issue, he explained. It's something we should not ignore. My mother's voice was tense. Are you saying she has heart disease? It's saying she needs to see a pediatric cardiologist for further evaluation. My father had asked the question I didn't understand at the time. How much would that cost? The doctor paused. It depends on the tests, but... That's not happening, my father interrupted. Even as a child, I could hear the firmness in his voice. Sir, the doctor said carefully, if this condition is confirmed, early monitoring is extremely important. Another pause followed. Then my mother said something that stayed buried in my mind for years. She's a dramatic child, she said, always fainting, always complaining about feeling dizzy. We think it's attention-seeking. The doctor didn't sound convinced. Well, the EKG results are not something a child can fake. But my father had already made up his mind. We're not putting our daughter through expensive medical tests for something that probably isn't real. I didn't understand the meaning of that conversation back then, but I understood something else. The way my parents walked out of that office looking annoyed. Not worried, annoyed. Back in the restaurant, my Aunt Carol's voice brought me back to the present. So you never followed up with the cardiologist? She asked slowly. My father folded his arms. No. And when Emily kept fainting over the years? My mother shrugged. We assumed it was anxiety. Jake blinked. For 15 years? My brother, Daniel, finally leaned forward again, clearly frustrated with the direction of the conversation. Oh my God, why are we acting like this is some huge conspiracy? Emily is fine. I looked at him. He said that word so easily. Fine. The same word my parents had used my entire life. But Lily shook her head. She collapsed on the floor tonight. Daniel rolled his eyes. She fainted. That's not the same thing as dying. Sarah crossed her arms. The doctor's voicemail literally said untreated episodes could be dangerous. Daniel scoffed. Well, clearly they weren't that dangerous if she's still alive. That sentence hit me harder than the fall earlier, because in that moment I realized something painful. My brother had grown up hearing the same story about me for so long that he truly believed it. To him, I wasn't a sister with a medical problem, I was just the drama queen. Across the table, Jake looked down at my phone again. There's more, he said quietly. Everyone turned toward him. What do you mean? Lily asked. Jake tapped the screen again. There's a text message from the same doctor. My mother's voice shot up instantly. Jake, give me that phone. But he leaned back slightly, keeping it out of her reach. Why? Because it's private, my father snapped. But Jake had already opened the message. He stared at the screen for a moment, his expression changing. What? Sarah asked. Jake looked up slowly. This was sent earlier today. My stomach tightened. Dr. Harris had told me he might contact me again once he finished reviewing my records. "Read it," Lily said. Jake hesitated, glancing at me. I gave a small nod. He cleared his throat and began reading. "Emily, after reviewing the documents your parents signed when you were 9, I discovered that they declined the recommended cardiology referral and refused additional diagnostic testing." A wave of murmurs spread around the table. Jake continued, "The paperwork includes a signed statement acknowledging the risk of untreated cardiac abnormalities." The room went dead quiet. Every pair of eyes slowly shifted toward my parents again, because that message contained something undeniable. Proof. Written proof. My father's face had turned pale. My mother looked furious. "That message is completely inappropriate," she said. But no one was listening to her anymore. Sarah spoke first. "Wait," she said. "You actually signed a document saying you refused further testing?" My father didn't answer. Lily's voice trembled slightly. "And you knew there was a risk?" Still no answer. Jake looked down at the phone again. "There's one more line." He read it slowly. "The doctor at the time strongly advised immediate follow-up care, warning that ignoring the condition could lead to serious episodes later in life." The silence that followed felt suffocating, because now the truth was clear. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't just parents making a mistake. This was a decision that had followed me for 15 years. A decision that had turned me into the family's joke. And as 25 relatives sat there absorbing the reality of what had happened, my parents realized something terrifying. They were no longer the ones controlling the story. The moment Jake finished reading the last line of the message, the air in the room changed. Before, there had still been uncertainty, doubt, people trying to give my parents the benefit of the doubt because that's what families do. But now there was proof sitting in Jake's hand, glowing quietly from the screen of my phone. A signed document, a warning, and a decision that had shaped 15 years of my life. No one rushed to defend my parents this time. Instead, people just stared at them. My Aunt Carol looked like someone had just pulled the floor out from under her. "You signed something?" she asked slowly. My father's jaw tightened. "That document doesn't mean what you think it means." Jake blinked. "It literally says you refuse the tests." My mother leaned forward sharply. "Because those tests were unnecessary." "According to who?" Sarah asked. My mother hesitated, and that hesitation told everyone everything. The truth was simple. They hadn't refused the tests because a doctor told them to. They refused them because they didn't want to deal with what those tests might reveal. Lily's voice was softer now, but somehow that made it more powerful. "You knew there was a chance she had a heart condition, and you still spent years telling her she was being dramatic?" My mother snapped back instantly. "Because she was dramatic." The room reacted immediately. Several relatives shifted in their chairs, not in agreement, in discomfort, because it was one thing to say that before anyone knew the truth, but now it sounded cruel. Daniel crossed his arms, clearly irritated. "Oh, come on," he said. "You're all acting like Mom and Dad tried to kill her." "No one said that," Sarah replied calmly. "But they did ignore a medical warning," Jake added. My father slammed his palm lightly on the table again. "We did what we believed was best for our family." That sentence echoed across the room, and for a second, no one responded. Because sometimes the most revealing thing a person can say is the thing they don't realize is revealing. Best for our family, not best for Emily. Best for the family. I felt Lily's hand tighten gently on my shoulder. "What does that even mean?" she asked quietly. My father looked around the table, clearly realizing the conversation had slipped far outside his control. You all have no idea what things were like back then, he said. Carol frowned. Then explain. My father rubbed his forehead, clearly frustrated. We had just lost my job. Insurance was a mess. Medical bills were piling up. Sarah nodded slowly. A lot of families go through that. Yes, my father said quickly, but not everyone has a child suddenly needing expensive heart specialists. My chest tightened again. There it was, finally spoken out loud. My mother jumped in immediately. And the doctor wasn't even sure, she said. It could have been nothing. But you didn't check, Jake reminded her. My mother's voice rose. Because we couldn't afford to chase every possible medical theory. A few people exchanged glances. Sarah spoke carefully. So instead, you decided to assume nothing was wrong. That's not fair, my father snapped. But Lily shook her head slowly. No, what's not fair is letting a child grow up thinking she's crazy for 15 years. That sentence landed hard because that was exactly what had happened. For 15 years, every time I fainted, every time I felt dizzy, every time my heart raced in ways that scared me, I had been told it was in my head. Drama, attention, exaggeration, and eventually I believed it. I remembered sitting alone in my college dorm bathroom after another blackout episode, staring at my reflection in the mirror and whispering to myself, maybe I really am just broken in some weird emotional way. That thought had followed me for years, but now the truth was sitting on the table in front of 25 witnesses. My cousin Mark finally spoke up from the far side of the room. So what was the plan? He asked. My father looked at him. What do you mean? Mark shrugged slightly. If the doctor warned you there could be serious episodes later in life, what did you think would happen? My father opened his mouth, then closed it again, because there was no good answer. Daniel tried to jump in again. This is ridiculous, he said. Emily's still alive. Clearly it wasn't that serious. I looked at him slowly. You know what the cardiologist told me 2 months ago? I asked quietly. The room turned toward me again. Daniel rolled his eyes slightly. What? I swallowed. He said if my condition had been monitored earlier, we probably could have prevented most of the fainting episodes. Silence spread across the group again. I continued. He also said untreated episodes can become more dangerous with age. Jake looked uneasy. More dangerous how? I met his eyes. Heart rhythm collapse. A few people gasped quietly. My Aunt Carol covered her mouth. You mean like a heart attack? Not exactly, I said softly, but it can stop the heart temporarily. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, not because they were new, but because this was the first time my entire family had heard them. Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. And you've been fainting like this for 15 years? I nodded. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, that sounds dramatic when you say it like that, but even he didn't sound convinced anymore, because now the room was filled with a new realization. Every fainting episode they'd laughed about, every time they rolled their eyes, every time they called me a drama queen, might have been a warning sign. Sarah looked at my parents again. So tonight, she said slowly, when Emily collapsed in front of everyone, she gestured toward the floor where I had been lying earlier. You really believed she was faking it? My mother crossed her arms. Yes. That answer stunned the room. Even now, after hearing everything, she refused to admit she might have been wrong. Lily stared at her. She could have been dying. My mother shook her head. She wasn't. And that's when something inside me finally snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, completely. Because hearing my mother dismiss it one more time made something very clear. They were never going to admit what they had done. Not willingly. But the night wasn't over yet, and there was still one truth left that none of them were prepared to hear. For a moment, after my mother insisted that nothing serious had happened, the room stayed quiet again. But it wasn't the same silence from earlier in the evening. This one felt heavier, almost uncomfortable, like everyone present was realizing they were witnessing something much deeper than a simple family disagreement. 25 people had come to celebrate a birthday. Instead, they were now sitting inside 15 years of buried truth. I leaned my head back against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. The dizziness had mostly faded, but my chest still felt tight, like my heart was beating just a little too hard against my ribs. Lily noticed. "Emily, are you okay right now?" she asked gently. Before I could answer, my mother spoke again. "She's fine." The words came out automatically, like a reflex she had practiced for years. Something about that made a few relatives exchange looks. Sarah frowned slightly. "Maybe we should let Emily answer." My mother opened her mouth to respond, but I spoke first. "I'm stable," I said slowly, "but I probably shouldn't be standing or walking right now." Daniel scoffed from his chair. "Here we go again." But no one laughed with him this time. Jake looked at him, clearly irritated. "Dude, she literally passed out." Daniel shrugged. "She's done that before." "Yes," Lily replied quietly, and apparently there was a medical reason for it the entire time. That sentence seemed to sink deeper into the room. For years, the story had been simple. Emily fainted because she was dramatic. Now that explanation looked a lot more fragile. My father suddenly stood up from his chair. The scraping sound echoed loudly across the floor. "That's enough," he said. All heads turned toward him. "This entire conversation has gotten completely out of control." Sarah raised an eyebrow. Out of control or uncomfortable? My father ignored the comment. "We're leaving," he said firmly. My mother stood as well, grabbing her purse. "Yes, this has gone on long enough." Daniel pushed his chair back too, clearly ready to follow them. For a moment, it looked like they might actually walk out. Just like that. 15 years of lies, exposed in one evening, and their solution was simply to leave the room. But something surprising happened before they could take a step. A voice stopped them. "Wait!" It was Aunt Carol. She rarely raised her voice during family gatherings. Usually she was the one smoothing over arguments and telling everyone to calm down. But tonight there was something different in her tone. My parents paused. Carol slowly stood up from her seat. "I invited everyone here tonight because we're family, and family doesn't walk out when things get uncomfortable." My mother forced a tight smile. "This is hardly the time or place for this discussion." Carol looked around the room. "Actually, I think this is exactly the place." Several relatives nodded quietly, because everyone present had now heard enough pieces of the story to realize how serious it was. My father's voice hardened. "You're all blowing this out of proportion." Jake shook his head. "No, the doctor's voicemail did that." My mother's eyes flashed toward me. "This entire situation started because Emily insisted on digging up old medical records." The accusation in her voice was unmistakable. But this time, instead of shrinking away like I usually did, I met her gaze. "I didn't dig them up," I said calmly. She frowned. "What do you mean?" "The cardiologist requested them." That detail made several people lean in again. Sarah spoke up. "Why would he request childhood records if you were only seeing him recently?" I hesitated for a moment, not because I didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud would shift the entire conversation again. Lily noticed the pause. "Emily," she said gently. I took a slow breath. Because 2 months ago, something worse happened. The room went still. My parents' expressions changed slightly, almost like they already knew what I was about to say. But the rest of the family didn't. Jake frowned. "What do you mean, worse?" I swallowed. "I collapsed at work." Several people gasped quietly. Daniel rolled his eyes again. "You fainted. That's not new." But I kept speaking. "No," I said softly. This time, my heart actually stopped. The words seemed to drain the air from the room. "What?" Lily whispered. I nodded slowly. Yes, it was only for a few seconds, but long enough that the paramedics had to restart it. My Aunt Carol sank slowly back into her chair. "Oh my God." Sarah looked stunned. That's cardiac arrest." My chest tightened again at hearing the phrase spoken out loud. Yes. Jake stared at me. "And that's when the cardiologist got involved?" Yes. Another wave of murmurs moved through the relatives, because now the situation sounded far more serious than fainting spells. My mother suddenly spoke again, her voice sharp. "And you're exaggerating it again." Every head snapped toward her. "What?" Lily said, stunned. "She didn't die. Her heart skipped a beat." I stared at her. "It stopped. Briefly." "It stopped," I repeated. The difference between those two words hung in the air. Stopped. Skipped. One sounded terrifying. The other sounded harmless. My mother clearly preferred the harmless version, but Sarah shook her head slowly. "That's not a small thing." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Well, it clearly started again." Jake glared at him. "Do you hear yourself?" But the real impact of my words hadn't even landed yet, because Lily suddenly looked at me with wide eyes. "Wait," she said slowly. "If the cardiologist reviewed your childhood records after that, then he must have compared the two." I nodded. "And?" My throat felt tight again. "And he said the same electrical pattern showed up in both tests." A long silence followed, because everyone understood what that meant. The warning from when I was 9 had been real, and if it had been treated back then, maybe the collapse at my job 2 months ago would never have happened. My Aunt Carol slowly looked at my parents. "So 15 years ago, a doctor warned you something might be wrong with her." No one spoke. "And 2 months ago, her heart actually stopped." The room felt like it was holding its breath. Carol's voice dropped lower. "And tonight, you watched her collapse on the floor and called her a drama queen." No one moved, because for the first time that night, the full weight of what had happened was sitting in the center of the room, and my parents were the only ones still pretending it wasn't real. But the night wasn't finished yet, because one more person in that room had something to say, something that would make the truth even harder to deny. For several long seconds after my Aunt Carol repeated the chain of events out loud, no one moved. The entire story had finally been laid out in a way no one could ignore. A doctor warning when I was 9, 15 years of fainting, my parents calling it drama, and 2 months ago, my heart stopping. It sat there in the middle of the table like something heavy no one knew how to pick up. My mother crossed her arms tightly, her expression hard. "You're all acting like we caused this," she said. No one responded immediately, because that was the question no one wanted to say out loud. Did they? Jake shifted in his chair, still holding my phone. "Well," he said slowly, "if a doctor warned you 15 years ago and you ignored it—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. My father's voice cut through the room again, sharp and defensive. We did not ignore it. Sarah looked at him steadily. You refused follow-up testing. That doesn't mean we ignored it. Then what does it mean? Lily asked quietly. My father opened his mouth, but before he could answer, another voice spoke. A calm voice, older. David, stop. Everyone turned. It was my Uncle Robert, my father's older brother. He had been silent most of the evening, sitting near the end of the table, listening carefully to everything. Now he slowly stood up. Robert had always been the quiet one in the family, the type of man who didn't say much, but when he did, people usually listened. He looked directly at my father. This has gone far enough. My father frowned. What are you talking about? Robert took a step closer to the table. I'm talking about the fact that this entire room tonight is watching you try to rewrite something we all heard. My father's face darkened. You don't know the full situation. Robert tilted his head slightly. Don't I? That simple question changed something in the room, because Robert didn't sound unsure. He sounded certain. My mother noticed it too. What do you mean by that? She asked. Robert looked around the room briefly, then back at my parents. I mean, he said slowly, that I remember that doctor's visit. The room went completely still. My heart skipped a beat. You what? My father said. Robert folded his arms. I remember the day Emily had that test when she was 9. Several relatives leaned forward. You were there? Sarah asked. Robert nodded. Yes. I blinked, trying to process that information. I had always remembered sitting alone in that hallway chair while my parents spoke to the doctor. I didn't remember anyone else being there. But Robert continued. I remember you asked me to drive you that day, he said to my father, because your car was in the shop. My father's face had gone pale. And I remember exactly what the doctor said, Robert added. My mother shook her head quickly. That was 15 years ago. You can't possibly remember. Yes, I can, Robert interrupted calmly. The firmness in his voice silenced the room again, because he didn't sound like someone guessing. He sounded like someone who had carried that memory for a long time. Jake leaned forward eagerly. What did the doctor say? Robert exhaled slowly. He said Emily's heart rhythm showed a pattern that needed to be investigated. That matched what Dr. Harris had said earlier. Sarah nodded slightly. That lines up. But Robert wasn't finished. He also said something else, he continued. My father looked like he wanted to interrupt, but Robert kept speaking. He said early treatment could prevent serious complications later in life. A murmur spread through the relatives again, because that sentence made the situation even clearer. But the most important part was still coming. Robert looked directly at my father. And I remember what you said when we left the office. My father's voice was tight. That's enough, Robert. But Robert ignored him. You said, and I quote, we're not spending thousands of dollars chasing a maybe. A collective gasp spread through the table. My mother stepped forward immediately. That's not what he meant. Robert held up a hand. I'm not finished. The room fell silent again. Robert's eyes moved slowly across the relatives. And then, Karen, he said, turning slightly toward my mother, you said something too. My mother's face tightened. I don't remember any such thing. Robert looked at her calmly. I do. A long pause stretched across the room. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. You said, and I quote, she'll grow out of it, and if she doesn't, we'll deal with it then. The words dropped into the room like a stone in water. Ripples of shock spread through every person sitting there, because that sentence meant something very clear. They hadn't just doubted the diagnosis. They had chosen to wait, to gamble, with my health. Lily looked horrified. You gambled with her heart? My mother shook her head quickly. That's not what we did. Robert didn't raise his voice, but his next sentence was even harder to ignore. You also said something else. My father closed his eyes briefly, like he knew what was coming. You said, Robert continued quietly, if we start treating her like she's sick, she'll think she is. The silence that followed felt endless, because suddenly 15 years of being called dramatic made sense. It hadn't just been denial, it had been a strategy. If they treated me like nothing was wrong, eventually everyone, including me, would believe it. Jake slowly lowered my phone onto the table. That's unbelievable. Sarah looked stunned. So instead of monitoring a possible heart condition, you decided to convince her it wasn't real? My mother looked desperate now. We were trying to protect her. From what? Lily asked. My mother hesitated. Then she said the one thing that made several people shake their heads. From growing up thinking she was fragile. I let out a soft, disbelieving breath. Fragile. For 15 years they had called me dramatic, but now the truth sounded very different. Across the table, Aunt Carol spoke again. So tonight, when Emily collapsed, she looked around the room. You still believed she was pretending? My father didn't answer. My mother didn't answer. But their silence was louder than any explanation they could have given. Because the truth had now been spoken by 3 different sources, the cardiologist, the medical records, and a witness from that day 15 years ago. The story my parents had told the family for years had finally collapsed. But the night still had one final twist left, because my phone suddenly lit up again on the table. Another call from the hospital. And this time, the message they were about to deliver would change everything about what happened next. For a moment, no one noticed the phone lighting up. Everyone was still frozen in the silence left behind by my Uncle Robert's words. The truth he had just spoken hung in the room like smoke after a fire, thick, impossible to ignore, and slowly settling over every person at the table. Then the vibration started. A sharp buzzing sound against the wooden surface. Everyone's attention snapped toward the phone. Jake looked down at it first. It's ringing again. My stomach tightened because the caller ID was different this time. Jake's eyes moved across the screen and the confusion on his face deepened. It says Riverside Medical Center. A ripple moved through the group. Sarah straightened in her chair. The hospital? Lily looked down at me immediately. Emily, were you expecting a call from them? I shook my head slowly. No. My mother reacted instantly. Don't answer it. The room turned toward her again. Jake frowned. Why not? It's probably nothing important, she said quickly. But the words sounded hollow, because a hospital rarely calls a patient for nothing important. The phone kept vibrating. Jake glanced between me and my parents. Emily? I took a slow breath. Answer it. My mother's voice shot up immediately. Don't. But Jake had already tapped the screen. He held the phone up to his ear. Hello? The room stayed completely silent as he listened. Then his eyebrows lifted slightly. Oh, hi. Another pause. Yes, this is her cousin. She's actually here with family right now. Jake looked toward me again. Yes, she can hear you if I put it on speaker. My heart started pounding. Go ahead, I said. Jake pressed the speaker button and placed the phone in the center of the table. A professional female voice filled the room. "Hello, this is Nurse Caldwell from Riverside Medical Center. I'm calling regarding Emily Carter." "That's me," I said weakly from the wall. "Hello, Emily. I apologize for calling so late, but your cardiologist asked us to contact you if we couldn't reach you earlier today." A few relatives exchanged looks. Dr. Harris again. "We reviewed your most recent test results this evening." My chest tightened. "And your doctor would like you to come into the hospital tonight if possible." The room stirred immediately. "Tonight?" Lily asked. The nurse continued calmly. "Yes, the monitoring data from your last appointment shows increased irregular activity in your heart rhythm." Several people leaned closer to the phone. "While this doesn't mean an immediate emergency," the nurse said carefully, "your cardiologist believes it would be safer to evaluate you sooner rather than later." Sarah's voice came out softly. "You mean she should go to the hospital now?" "Yes," the nurse replied. The words seemed to echo through the dining hall. "Hospital, now." My mother shook her head quickly. "This is completely unnecessary." The nurse paused. "I'm sorry, who is speaking?" "My mother," I said quietly. "Well, Emily's doctor is recommending observation due to her recent cardiac episode and the pattern we're seeing in her tests." Jake blinked. "Wait, you mean the episode from 2 months ago?" "Yes," the nurse replied. "That event is part of the reason we are taking these readings seriously." My father suddenly stepped forward. "This is ridiculous." Everyone turned toward him. "She fainted tonight because she likes attention," he said loudly. "There's no reason for her to go to a hospital." A stunned silence spread through the room. Even the nurse paused on the other end of the line. Then she spoke carefully. "Sir, if Emily experienced another fainting episode tonight, that would make the situation more concerning, not less." Sarah shook her head slowly. "David, stop." But my father continued, "She's done this her entire life." The nurse's tone remained calm, but it became firmer. "Sir, untreated cardiac rhythm disorders can become more dangerous over time." The words seemed to land directly in the center of the table, because everyone there already knew that part now. The nurse continued, "That's why her doctor recommended long-term monitoring after the event 2 months ago." Jake looked shocked. "So this has been an ongoing concern?" "Yes," the nurse said, "and tonight's fainting episode suggests the condition may be progressing." A heavy silence followed. My mother shook her head again. "This is exactly what I mean. Doctors always make things sound worse than they are." That sentence seemed to be the final straw for several people. Lily stood up. "That's enough." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the entire room. "You don't get to dismiss this anymore." My mother glared at her. "You're not her parent." "No," Lily replied calmly, "but I'm someone who cares whether she lives." The words hit the table like dropped glass. My mother's face flushed red. "How dare you?" "No, how dare you?" The room fell silent again, because for the first time all evening, someone was speaking to my parents without hesitation. Sarah nodded slowly. "She's right." Jake looked at me. "Emily, do you want to go to the hospital?" The question hung in the air. For years, my parents had answered that question for me. Tonight, for the first time, everyone was waiting for my answer. My chest still felt tight, my body still felt weak from collapsing earlier, and the nurse was still waiting on the phone. "Yes," I said quietly. Relief spread across several faces. "Okay, if you can come in tonight, we'll have a cardiology team ready to evaluate you." Jake grabbed his keys immediately. "I'll drive." Lily nodded. "I'm coming too." Sarah stood as well. "Me too." 3 people. 3 family members ready to help without hesitation. My parents stared at them in disbelief. "You're all overreacting," my father said. But no one was listening anymore. because something had shifted in the room. For years, the family had believed my parents' version of the story. Tonight, that version had shattered, and as Lily helped me slowly to my feet, I realized a surprising thing. I didn't feel embarrassed anymore. I didn't feel like the drama queen. For the first time in my life, I felt like someone people believed. But the biggest moment of the night was still waiting, because before we could leave the restaurant, my Aunt Carol stood up again, and what she said next would make the entire room turn back toward my parents one last time.
We had just started to move toward the exit when my Aunt Carol cleared her throat. The room turned back to her, and suddenly all the energy that had been building throughout the evening shifted. Carol's presence carried weight. People listened when she spoke because she never wasted words, and when she spoke about accountability, it landed like a hammer. "David, Karen," she said slowly, letting her gaze sweep over both of them. "I've been quiet all night, but it's time someone says it clearly. You abandoned Emily in a moment she needed you most. Not tonight, 15 years ago, and every year since." My mother's face tightened. My father's jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed like they might argue, but Carol held up her hand. "You may try to explain it away," she continued, "but the facts are written in medical records, in voicemails, and witnessed by more than one family member tonight. You didn't just doubt her feelings, you actively dismissed them, even when evidence was in front of you, and Emily almost paid the price for it." The room was dead silent. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, but not from dizziness. This was a rush of clarity, of witnessing truth being named for the first time. My father finally spoke, his voice tight and low. We never intended for her to collapse, to be in danger, to feel like her experiences didn't matter." Carol finished for him, her voice sharper now. "Exactly. That's what you did. That's what 15 years of calling her a drama queen did." My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again. She was grasping for words that would soften the blow, but there weren't any. She realized it now. The truth couldn't be erased. I stood a little straighter, with Lily on one side, Jake on the other. For the first time, I didn't feel small. The labels, the disbelief, the endless whispers of, "She's exaggerating," felt meaningless now. I had the evidence, the witness, and most importantly, I had survived. Carol continued, her voice now quieter but piercing. "Emily doesn't need your approval or your excuses anymore. What she needs is support, and that starts tonight before she leaves for the hospital." There was a shuffle in the room. My cousins whispered amongst themselves. Some looked ashamed, some looked relieved that the truth was finally out. Daniel's face was pale, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by uncertainty. Even he couldn't argue against the facts. My father's voice broke slightly. We thought we were protecting her." Carol's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, but her tone remained firm. "Protecting her? From what? The truth? From herself? You didn't protect her, you abandoned her, and you've been doing it for years under the guise of care." I took a deep breath. I hadn't said a word in a long time. The evening had been a storm of revelations, and now I felt the need to speak, not out of anger, but from the quiet place inside that had been aching to be heard. "You don't get to rewrite what happened," I said softly but clearly, looking at both of them. "I was 9. I was scared, and every time I felt dizzy or fainted, you told me I was making it up. You told me I was dramatic, and when it mattered most, you chose not to act. Not because it wasn't serious, but because you were scared, and that fear cost me years of trust, years of believing in myself, and years of knowing that my feelings mattered." The room stayed still. No one spoke. My parents' faces were pale. I continued, letting the words out slowly. "I am not the drama queen you made me out to be.
I am the person who survived your decisions. I am the person who is about to get the care you refused. And you are going to have to live with the fact that for 15 years you abandoned me emotionally and physically when I needed you most." I paused. The words hung in the air. A few relatives had tears in their eyes, including Lily. My Uncle Robert's gaze was steady, approving. He didn't need to say anything. His presence alone was enough. Finally, my father muttered, barely audible, "We didn't know how serious it could be." "You didn't want to know," I said softly, and that made it real. For everyone watching tonight, it's clear what happened. The evidence doesn't lie. Carol stepped closer to my parents. "Tonight isn't about blaming anyone for what could have been prevented years ago. It's about accountability. Emily is about to leave for the hospital. If you have anything to do now, it's to support her, and I mean truly support her. Not dismiss, not belittle, not delay. Support." My mother's shoulders slumped. My father looked at the floor. For the first time, they weren't deflecting. They weren't arguing. They were quiet. And for the first time, it felt like they were listening. Jake helped me slip into my coat. Lily grabbed my bag. I could feel the adrenaline in my veins, the mixture of exhaustion and empowerment washing over me. The night had been brutal, exposing truths I had been forced to bury for years, but it had also freed me in a way nothing else could. As we walked toward the car, I caught sight of the rest of the family at the table. Some were watching with concern, others with guilt, and some with quiet relief that the truth had finally come out. I didn't need them to forgive my parents, not yet. I didn't even need them to fully understand. I just needed to know that for the first time in years, my side of the story was being acknowledged. We piled into Jake's car. The city lights blurred outside the windows, the cool night air heavy with tension, anticipation, and relief. Lily reached over and lightly squeezed my hand. "You're not alone tonight," she said softly. I nodded, swallowing hard. "I never have been, just my parents made it feel that way." Jake started the car, and as we drove through the empty streets toward the hospital, I finally let myself exhale. 15 years of being called a drama queen, 15 years of doubt, 15 years of small humiliations, dismissals, and fear. Tonight, it was ending. And even though I was about to face more tests, more monitoring, and more uncertainty, I felt stronger than ever. Because for the first time, my truth had been seen, heard, and validated. And that, I realized, was worth everything.
The hospital lights were harsh when we arrived, a sharp contrast to the dim warmth of the restaurant where everything had collapsed. But the moment we walked into the cardiology ward, the weight I had been carrying for 15 years began to feel lighter. I wasn't alone anymore. Lily stayed close, holding my arm. Jake carried my bag, and even a few relatives had joined quietly, offering silent support. The air smelled of antiseptic and electricity, but it no longer felt intimidating. It felt like a place of truth. Nurse Caldwell greeted us at the entrance, her calm presence somehow grounding. "Emily," she said gently, "we'll start with continuous monitoring. The cardiology team has reviewed your records and is ready to act if necessary." I nodded, still feeling the tightness in my chest, but not from dizziness. It was the emotion that had been building for years. Fear, betrayal, shame, all tangled together. And now, for the first time, I could face it without them dictating the story of my life. As they wheeled me into the monitoring room, I took a deep breath. The quiet hum of the machines felt almost like a rhythm, syncing with my heartbeat and grounding me. Lily held my hand while Jake stayed close by. It was strange to think that these two people who had never been part of my family's lies were the ones holding the space for my truth. Once I was settled, my phone vibrated again. I glanced at the screen.
My parents had sent a text. I hesitated, then opened it. We're sorry. We didn't realize. It ended there. Short, incomplete, and yet heavier than any lecture or argument. For the first time, I realized that even when apologies come, they are only a beginning. And sometimes they're not about relieving guilt, they're about acknowledging truth. I put the phone down and let myself breathe. The nurses started hooking me up to monitors, and the cardiologist came in shortly after. Dr. Harris smiled softly at me, a mixture of reassurance and concern in his eyes. "Emily, your readings tonight are stable, but your heart rhythm shows patterns that need careful observation. We're going to take every precaution." As the nurse adjusted the leads on my chest, I reflected on the night. 15 years of fainting spells, of being labeled dramatic, of feeling invisible. Tonight had changed everything. Not because my heart condition suddenly went away, but because I finally had a voice. I finally had witnesses. I finally had someone outside my family who believed me. Hours passed in the quiet rhythm of machines and monitors. Occasionally, Lily or Jake would whisper a joke to make me laugh, breaking the tension just enough for me to remember I was still human, still alive, still worthy of care and attention. Meanwhile, my parents had been waiting in the family room, I was told later. They hadn't left, though they hadn't come in either. That was the strange thing. After all the confrontation, they were present, silently watching, absorbing what had happened. It wasn't a victory for them, but it wasn't the end of their relationship with me either, and in some small, unexpected way, that was progress. By the early hours of the morning, the monitoring showed no immediate danger. Dr. Harris came in, leaning against the doorframe, and said softly, "Emily, your heart is stable tonight, but we need to make a long-term plan. You'll need regular monitoring, maybe medication, and possibly minor procedures down the road. But you're strong. You've survived a lot already." I let out a long breath I didn't know I had been holding. "Thank you," I said quietly. Dr. Harris smiled. "Thank yourself, too. You're the one who made it here tonight." That sentence struck me harder than anything anyone else had said all night, because for 15 years I had been told I was helpless, fragile, and dramatic. Tonight I realized the truth. I was neither helpless nor fragile. I had survived negligence and disbelief. I had survived betrayal. And now I was finally allowed to survive on my own terms, with support, but on my terms. By sunrise, I was resting in the hospital bed, monitors beeping gently, my body finally at ease. Lily sat beside me, asleep in a chair she had claimed as her own, and Jake dozed in the corner. I stared out the window, watching the first light of day creep across the city skyline. The world felt quiet, but it also felt like a promise that things could be different now, that I could be different now. When my parents finally came in, the atmosphere was awkward but subdued. They didn't speak much, but the tension was no longer defensive. There was a weight of acknowledgement. They weren't apologizing yet. They probably wouldn't fully understand the impact of their choices overnight. But being present, listening quietly, was a start. And sometimes that's all you can ask for in a family. Over the next few weeks, I began my follow-up treatments. Each test, each monitoring session, each conversation with my cardiologist reinforced one truth. My fainting episodes were never a game, never attention-seeking. And every time I thought back to the nights of disbelief, to the words that had echoed in my childhood and adulthood, I realized something else. Survival isn't just about the body. It's about the soul, and I had survived both. Eventually, I started sharing the story publicly, not as a way to shame my parents, but as a way to reclaim my own voice. I spoke carefully, honestly, and with the raw emotion that had been buried for so long. People listened, people believed, people wrote back to tell me their own stories, their own betrayals and recoveries, and through sharing, I discovered a strange kind of freedom, the freedom to be heard, to matter, and to finally close a chapter that had haunted me for 15 years. One evening, a month later, I sat on my apartment balcony with Lily and Jake. The city lights shimmered below, soft and calm. "You okay?" Lily asked. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, for the first time in a long time, I feel whole." Jake smiled. "You should. You've been through hell and came out alive. Not just alive, stronger." I looked at them both and realized they were right. It wasn't the fainting spells that defined me. It wasn't my parents' mistakes. It was my resilience, my courage, and my voice, which no one could ever take away again. Sometimes family fails you. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you instead choose comfort, convenience, or denial over care. But survival doesn't require them to change. Survival requires you to claim your truth, even when the world refuses to believe it. And that's exactly what I did. For 15 years, I was the drama queen they wanted me to be. For 15 years, they abandoned me in moments that mattered most. But tonight, and every night from now on, I am my own advocate. I am my own witness. I am my own survivor. And that is the truth.